we have hello all. We have another session today, which will be about exploring the critical concept of potential output and its significance in shaping effective monetary policy, particularly within flexible inflation targeting frameworks. We'll discuss a paper that critiques traditional methods like HP and Kalman filters for estimating potential output, advocating instead for a more holistic approach using the FPAS Mark II framework. The discussion will also highlight how institutions like the Bank of Canada and Reserve Bank of New Zealand balance mechanical models with the flexibility needed to manage economic stability, especially during uncertain times like the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have a very valuable guest, Robert Ford, who is a very esteemed economist. He has been a deputy director at OECD and an assistant director at IMF. We look forward to his insights and his questions, and thank you, Robert, for being here. Today's session will be started off by Sylvie, who will introduce the concepts of potential output and the issues related to it and importance of ameliorating the way that we deal with estimating it. And so the floor is yours. You can share the screen.
Okay, thank you, Tintin. Let me share. Can you see it?
Yes.
I can.
Okay. So, hello everyone again. As Tintin said, today Satanik and I will discuss the potential output estimation, focusing mainly on the importance of measuring potential output and on how we can use it with some concrete examples. So, estimating potential output is a complex task, and in the global forecasting school we used to compare it to a unicorn, because just a unicorn we can discuss it but we can't see it. And the potential output, the output gap is estimation. The output gap is especially important under the flexible inflation targeting framework, because estimating potential output under this framework helps to manage the short-run inflation output trade-off. So properly estimating that potential output helps central banks to make the right decisions to balance that inflation output trade-off. And in the contrast, mismeasuring that potential output will lead to incorporate monetary policies, worsening the economic situation, and also amplifying that economic shocks. And when estimating potential output, it's essential to understand the underlying theory before making some measurements, and we just note to rely solely on the HP filters or Kalman filters for that measurement, but we at first need to understand to adjust that filter to dynamic situation, and because that filters doesn't show the economic changes on the potential output, and here we need that judgment. We need consider the broader economic context beyond that models. So as I mentioned, the output gap is measuring the output gap is mainly important for the inflation targeting for the countries under the inflation targeting framework, and it's because that framework allows for inflation deviations from the target. It allows that flexibility allows inflation to adjust that shocks that affect the short-run inflation, and therefore while models are useful, but we don't need rely solely on them. and we need that judgment, that critical thinking to manage that impacts of shocks. So, and during that COVID-19 pandemic, was a good example of testing the frameworks, testing how some institutions measure their potential output, and testing that methods that they use. And we can see that generally institutions with established framework manage that shocks more effectively. So let's discuss some country cases to examine how different institutions manage to during that situation. We have some examples from countries such as Canada, New Zealand, Czech Republic, and United States regarding how they measure their potential output. So about the Czech Republic, we can say that it uses the same Kalman filter and HP filters for estimating their potential output. And in contrast, we can see the New Zealand and Canada also using that judgment along with these filters for their estimations. And Satanik will discuss that approaches in detail. So now let me mainly focus on the United States, where the Congressional Budget Office, we know that Congressional Budget Office provide that estimations for potential output here, and we have some reasons to believe that these estimates need to be adjusted for the COVID period, just as they did for the global financial crisis. And during that initial shock, and let's see why we are thinking like that. Because during the initial shocks of the pandemic, we have both aggregate demand and aggregate supply fell. But the question is here whether the aggregate demand fell more or less than the aggregate supply. And we have some factors that we will discuss following. We have some factors that we'll discuss following, and that will show that during this initial phase of the COVID pandemic, aggregate demand fell more than aggregate supply. So in the first stage of the COVID-19, we have that lockdowns that affected certain activities such as the international vacations and so on, and that substitution from the different activities was limited. And on the contrary, that substitution, intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which reflects the substitution substitution over time, was higher, and as a result, people preferred to postpone today's consumption and save more, waiting for later to spend it. And this high increase in savings lead to more decline in demand compared to supply. And so this is our first argument, why we think that supporting the idea that demand will fell more than supply during that period. And also during that times of crisis, there are people were enabled to have access some financial support, accessing some of that financial markets, which reduce their spending in that time. And even countries like the United States face that problem, because people face difficulties to have difficulties to limited savings and borrowing options. So this is our second argument. And another argument is about showing that there was a success supply in that early stages of COVID pandemic is the evidence that about is evident when we look at the inflation, because during those periods we can see that inflation changes a little comparing to that significant change in the unemployment. This is because inflation didn't respond much to that output gap, because there was a too weak demand was too weak in that time relative to supply, so firms didn't have the opportunity to have higher prices, and in contrast unemployment raised significantly, and as a result we have a flat Phillips curve, and we can see from here that such recession periods, these recession periods such as the COVID-19, a larger output gap doesn't necessarily lead to a higher inflation as we have during this time. These are the main factors that showing that during the initial part of the COVID pandemic, demand fed more than the supply. But after that part, after the implementation of significant fiscal policy, expansionary fiscal policy,
I think we have problems with Sylvie's internet. Sylvie, you're back.
or can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think I have some problems with my connection.
Yeah, you can, you know where you glitched, right? You
No.
continue from
It
there.
was when you spoke about that Phillips curve are flat. See.
Okay. Just let me share my screen again and I will continue from that part. As I mentioned, the Phillips curve was flat, and we can see from here that during that recession period, a larger output gap doesn't necessarily lead to higher inflation. And so these are the main factors that show that during that COVID period, the initial part of the COVID period, we have the demand fell more than the supply. However, after the implementation of expansionary fiscal policies, both supply and demand began to grow, and in that period, we have demand grow faster and stronger than supply. So the period of excess supply followed by the period of the excess demand, and we have the very big gap between the demand and supply, and which creating this inflationary environment for the U.S. economy. So also as the supply side, from the supply side, we know that the supply chain disruptions, the higher unemployment affects this period to supply to increase more slowly than demand, because we have the because even temporary job losers have negative effects on that supply, as people lose their skills, their professional expertise, and overall that labor productivity also declines. And also there are some firms that were closed because of that supply chain disruptions, and it's prolonging that recovery process for supply side. And so all these factors suggest that the the CBO estimations for potential output doesn't in some cases align with the COVID period. So considering these factors, we believe that CBO needs to adjust its potential output estimations. And here we can observe the difference between the potential output estimations according to the Global Forecasting School and the CBO. And as a result, I can see a smaller output gap that they want based on the Congressional Budget Office. So that's all from my part. Thank you very much. Now, Satanik will continue to discuss the cases of Canada and New Zealand. So, Satanik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvie-Can. Can you move the next slide, please? Thanks. Hello again. I'm Sateni Gevorkan. Sylvie spoke about the importance of measuring potential output, especially for flexible inflation targeting countries, and also about CBO. I will speak about Bank of Canada measurement and Bank of Zealand measurement. So, Sylvie, can you move the next slide? Thank you. The Bank of Canada considers 4 criteria in evaluating methods used to measure potential output. The first criterion is that approach should provide economic interpretation. The second one is that estimated potential output should be helpful in identifying inflationary and disinflationary pressures in the economy. The third criterion is that assumptions and statistical relationship conditioning potential output estimates should be consistent with the data. And the fourth one is that the tools should be helpful for both estimating and projecting potential. While speaking about these 4 criteria, one question is arising in my head. Are these 4 criteria enough? I can say no, because while these criteria are solid and robust, focusing narrowly on inflation may not provide a holistic approach and understanding of the economy. A primary concern with emphasizing inflation is that it may overshadow other critical aspects of economic health, such as employment, income distribution, and financial stability. Potential output, being a broader concept, should ideally reflect not just inflationary pressures, but also how well the economy can sustain growth without triggering imbalances in other areas. Focusing narrowly on the output gap as a predictor of inflation and losing the big picture can be limiting, because this assumes a direct and immediate relationship between the output gap and inflation, which may not be always true in real world, especially in the presence of supply shocks and other complex dynamics. More, we can say that the exclusive focus on inflation can also lead to unintended consequences. For instance, an overly strict adherence to the inflation target might prompt the bank to raise interest rates in response to supply-side shocks, and such action could suppress economic activity or stifling growth, and also to drive higher unemployment. And it's nonsense, because the inflationary pressures are temporary and not demand driven. Bank of Canada relies on combination of statistical models and judgment to estimate potential output. This is a standard practice, and the bank may sometimes lean too heavily on mechanical modeling exercises without sufficiently incorporate real-world judgment or understanding the specific context of Canadian economy. And this can lead to less accurate output gap. And speaking about, Sylvie, can you move Thank you. Speaking about supply shocks, there is also one question. Is the Bank of Canada adequately prepared to handle supply or stagflation shocks when they have come to forefront, especially with recent decreasing in oil prices? The BOC's current framework, which relies heavily on inflation targeting, it's flexible inflation targeting, but it's not flexible enough, and they may face some limitation in addressing these challenges. While the BOC has shown here some flexibility, but the traditional reliance on baselines may not fully capture the complexity of potential shocks. And if BOC were to adopt a scenario-based approach, it could significantly improve its ability to respond to various economic challenges, including supply shocks and stagflations. Under FPAS Mark II, scenario-based approach allows for the consideration of multiple potential outcomes rather than relying on one single baseline projection. And this would not only enhance the BOC's readiness for unexpected shocks, but also strengthen its forward guidance. In times of economic uncertainty, a clear and transparent communication becomes even more critical by adopting a scenario-based approach, and BOC could provide more nuanced guidance to the financial market and the public, helping to manage expectations more effectively. And also this could lead to better aligned market responses and a more stable economic environment. And when Sylvie, please, can you? Thank you. When discussing potential output, it's important to differentiate between the short run and the long-run potential output. In short run, actual output may deviate from potential output due to changes in aggregate demand, causing inflationary or deflationary gaps. And in the long run, potential output aligns with the long-run aggregate supply, which is vertical because over long term, the economy's output is determined by the factors like technology, innovation, labor, and capital rather than price level. And as a result, actual output growth is generally more variable than potential output level because it's much less variable due to dependence on these gradual changes. And another institution with a broader experience base than the Bank of Canada is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Thank you. Where are undergraduate students that do better than the Bank of Canada. This might be because they have some lack of experience than in Bank of Canada, and they bring fresh judgment to the table. And paradoxically, having too much experience and knowledge can sometimes complicate estimations, which could explain why the students are often successful. So the Reserve Bank of New Zealand deserves high marks for adjusting their estimates in real time to explain they are managing the short run, how they explain to how they managing their short run output inflation trade-off. And they continuously update their estimates of potential output to gain better understanding of the economy supply-side dynamics. And this process involves combining a conceptual understanding of the economy with real-time data rather than relying solely on mechanical filters that use historical data. And estimating potential output requires careful judgment to distinguish between short-term fluctuations and long-term shifts in the economic capacity. And here are one of the good examples are when Airbnb adjust their potential output growth estimation for 2015 based on several factors, like they assume that strong business confidence suggests that the future investment could be stronger than anticipated. The supply of labor was expected to be stronger than initially predicted because of increased net immigration, and also they assumed that the growth of potential output will be in peak in the middle of the year, driven by strong construction spendings, increasing net immigration, and high export prices. And however, they also remained aware of rising inflationary pressures. And for them, it's crucial for inflation expectations to remain contained and anchored. So I can say that the Airbnb's example demonstrates how central banks can adjust their estimates of potential output using real-time data to respond effectively to the current economic environment. Thank you for your attention. Me and Sylvie have prepared this. It's an honor to have such an audience.
Thank you, Sylvie and Sataning. It was an interesting presentation, especially given that Sylvie addressed the issues of 2021, the debate that I think is still ongoing, whether the inflation of that period was transitory or not, and how misspecification of an output gap and potential output can lead an economist to think in a certain way. And Saturn's example of New Zealand and Canada was also illuminating. And I agree that output gap can tell us a lot, but there are also instances where, which could potentially be what's happening in UK, where we have potentially have reached the maximum output gap, and excess demand is just translated into inflation and not necessarily into more production and more output. So it is a valuable indicator, and thank you for your presentation about it. Mr. Robert Ford, do you have anything to add to it? Do you have any questions? We'd be happy to listen.
If you could go back to your very first slide that Sylvie put up, though, the one where you show the output gaps and stuff like that. I think that's a good slide. I like that slide.
This one?
Yeah, that one. Yeah. So this is a good slide to talk about these sort of things. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, looking at potential output and on the natural rate of unemployment and all that kind of stuff has become very important in the sense that somehow, and I think this is a bad thing, somehow practical macroeconomics has come down to estimating various gaps. And, so now we have a new one, R star, right? Which is it's the same thing, right? It's just estimating another gap. I read recently a paper by somebody, I think maybe the IMF, where they talk about where they talk explicitly about the R star gap. They sort of invert the usual gap equation and get an R star gap, I suppose. It's sort of debt sustainability. They invert the debt sustainability equation and get the debt sustainability in terms of the difference between interest rates, projected interest rates, and some sort of measure of R star. And certainly I would argue that the GFS estimates of potential output, the left-hand side chart, are much closer to what I think of reality than the CBO. I mean, if you're right here, they just say the potential output didn't move at all, that the entire is that right? Is that the right interpretation of that graph, that the CBO says that the entire COVID thing was just a straight up demand shock? Is that right? Okay. So of course they get a big gap. I would go further. I don't think any of it was a demand shock, essentially, right? So I think while you go in the right direction, you don't go far enough. I would encourage you to go further along the lines that you're looking, sort of adjusting your potential output for various things, right? And if I look at the top right-hand thing, I mean, the sticky CPI less food and energy is a hard thing to interpret, but a straightforward story of what happened was that the potential output, the output gap didn't change hardly at all. And I'm not saying this is the right story, but this seems to me to be an easy, pretty good story that that the COVID period didn't change the output gap materially at all, maybe a little bit, but here and there, right? Because if it had, you'd expect a lot of deflation, and we don't see a lot of deflation. We don't see any deflation really during that period, and that's hard to square with even your potential output gap. And then later on, we see some inflation, and you could easily interpret that to all the. You can easily attribute that to all the monetary and fiscal stimulus. Well, not so much, monetary and fiscal, fiscal stimulus mainly, that was put in response to what was perceived by the CBO, for example, as this huge output gap, and that was just a policy mistake. You could do that under that interpretation. All that stimulus was, in some sense, just a policy mistake, right? It was due to the fact that they didn't properly adjust their potential output series, like you're trying to do, right? So I'm all in favor. I'm in favor of what you're trying to do. There is some sort of timing. If you look at that top chart, there's a bit of a timing thing, right? The inflation starts up. I mean, you don't have any material output gap after the COVID. Nobody has any material output gaps, little bits here and there, tiny bits. And so it's difficult to explain the inflation thing. Now, one explanation, as somebody mentioned, I think Tina mentioned, that there's still a lot of dispute over what that inflation really was. Was it due to excess demand, or was it due to supply constraints? And I would say nobody really knows yet. So I think that's an important issue to ponder, just what's going on there with that little burst in inflation. It's difficult. It's going to be difficult to answer for a while. I think you're moving in the right direction. I would try and move further in the right direction. The other thing is this timing issue with the inflation. I mean, there's this old story, basically from Milton Friedman about 40 or 50 years ago, who talked about long and variable lags, 12 to 18 months lags between changes in monetary policy and changes in inflation. Somebody should estimate, you guys should look into whether that's true, right? I mean, I haven't seen very much recent empirical estimation of just how long and variable the lags really are. And it's an important consideration, right, both for interpreting the data and for policy, right? Because the interest in, or stepping back, the interest in estimating things like output and I go back to your title about unicorns. I mean, the thing about unicorns is they don't exist, right? I mean, it's not that we can't see them; there are no unicorns. And so, when it comes to things like output gaps and stuff like that, I sort of lean along that interpretation, that they don't exist in the sense that we really can't measure them, much less forecast them. So, I mean, you got to try, but you have to, maybe this is like we are saying, you have to use judgment and stuff like that. You got to try, but you have to keep uppermost in your mind that you're going to be wrong. We don't have very good theories about how potential output moves. Most of it is in the residual, right? Most cyclical movements in potential output, you can write down a production function and estimate labor and capital. But most of the movement of interest is in the residual term, the so-called technical change term. And by definition, we don't know what the residual is, right? I mean, that's why it's a residual. So you should, maybe this is a reinforcing your idea that you need to use a lot of judgment here. You can't rely on mechanical, this is sort of a theme in your talk, that you can't rely on mechanical stuff. I would certainly agree with that. You can't rely on it hardly at all. And so what would be nice, which is not your job, but it's the job of some smart guy at Harvard or MIT or somewhere like that, is to come up with a new foundation for macroeconomics. It doesn't rely on these unobservable gaps. It's a little awkward for macroeconomics that it relies really a lot on stuff that even in principle we can't observe. Is that really a scientific theory, that you rely on stuff you can't observe? I mean, would anybody else get away with that? I'm not sure, but that's where we are with macroeconomics these days. So that's my sort of high level look at what I think about this. I'm very suspicious about these gap estimate business.
Thank you so much. It was interesting.
Thank you so much.
The unobservables have been a topic of discussion at GFS for quite some time, and and I agree that it's very much up to judgment, and it's interesting to see what different economists have to say about it, and yeah, it would be great if we live to the age when macroeconomics is more like a science and less about what one thinks and less judgmental.
Chasing unicorns.
Yeah, less about unicorns. So thank you, Robert, for your input. Now we have Douglas Luxton joining.
I would only say there's a little bit of inconsistency in what he said, right? Because on the one hand, he told you exactly how to adjust the gaps to make them more plausible. And on the other hand, he was critical about the entire framework. So I was just noting that, Bob,
Well, that's because I'm not a smart guy at Harvard. I'm not the guy who's gonna revolutionize macroeconomics. I'm stuck in the same framework that you are.
But anyway, those were very helpful comments. I think that you do need to adjust the output gap. Like there doesn't appear to be enough excess demand. Okay, that would be consistent with a Oken's law type of relationship where we shut down. Okay, maybe demand fell a little bit more than supply. That's Bob's story. But then when fiscal and monetary provides a lot of demand and we start opening up, supply comes back slower, the whole bottleneck story. And that would allow you to tell a story that when I look at your unemployment indicator, it goes into excess demand, but your goods market output gap doesn't seem to have enough excess demand in kind of summer of 2021. So that is when kind of inflation started to drift up. And it's not just a sticky price one. I'd also get back to Bob a little bit in the sense that if you think the Phillips curve's really flat, you could still have, like in the region that we're in, you could still have significant excess demand. Like when we typically think of parameters, we think of like 0.1s and stuff, right? So you can still have quite a bit of excess demand and excess supply initially with inflation just going down a little bit. And then if we go into excess demand in say the summer of 2021, then you could have inflation coming back more rapidly. In other words, the convex Phillips curve story that we were telling in the Not the Teal book, that the Phillips curve steepened the way that that George Evans explained it in a Better Policy Project seminar. This is based on his work in I guess 1985. He wrote a paper in the Economic Journal that said that the asymptote of the convex Phillips curve depends on the proportion of firms that are hitting bottlenecks in the economy. So one can think of that proportion of bottlenecks shifting the Phillips curve in and making it steeper. Thus, small amounts of excess demand resulted in a lot of the buildup in inflation. So, now, back to what Bob said about supply shocks. And so when we think of this excess demand measure, we just think of the difference between aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the goods market. And so if that relationship is non-linear, then you can have pretty big excess supply gaps, and that would be consistent with inflation only falling a bit from throughout 2020, and then the Phillips curve becoming more steep, and then of course demand shifting out, and then a small amount of excess demand, a modest amount, explaining why inflation kind of went up. That's kind of putting the unicorn. It's dressing the unicorn up pretty.
I mean,
pretty well.
I mean, what you're saying, you know, the way you describe it, sort of encapsulates my problem here. You know, you can always have the Phillips curve move around to ex post justify any pattern of inflation you want, right? So once it was flat, you know, so you get a little bit of disinflation you get some disinflation. Now suddenly it's steep because you need it to be steep, stuff like that. I mean, this is, you know, if you keep doing this, you're soon going to be lost. You know, my interpretation of the episode as a whole is that the Phillips curve. I mean, if we buy that burst of inflation in your sticky price measure as being underlying inflation, which is supposed to be, you know, that's what it's getting at, as opposed to supply constraints, temporary supply constraints. If that's how we interpret that measure, which is fair enough. Then, you know, the Phillips curve is essentially vertical now. That's my interpretation, right? I mean, we had that all around the world, basically, that inflation disappeared. Interest rates went up, the inflation disappeared, and there was no big change in unemployment or output or anything, right? There was no, they seemed to disappear without any gaps, what they called the immaculate disinflation. Right, which is fine. I mean, if that's true, that'd be an interesting thing to look at. If that's true, that's terrific for macroeconomics, right? If you can get rid of inflation at no output cost, you don't have to induce a big recession like they did in 1980 to get rid of inflation. That would be just great for the world.
So it's
and for central banks. And for central banks.
It's too soon to tell. Okay,
I know.
And that's what makes it interesting. So you guys should consider coaching in those terms. That it's interesting now and forward-looking aspect. Does the U.S. really need recession, okay, to bring underlying inflation down to target? And,
apparently not. I mean.
And I think the answer still is yes. But Bob is open.
You're hanging on.
Bob is open to the possibility that somehow the world has completely changed and stuff. Okay, so did he give you good comments? Or I hope you weren't disappointed with his comments. But okay, I've been telling them a lot about you, Bob.
Only good things, I hope. Only the good things.
Pretty good things. So, I think pretty good things. So, thanks. Is there anything else on the agenda, Tina?
Nothing. The session ends now. I think we discussed everything, unless you have more comments. Thank you.
No.
The little debate was very interesting and insightful to see the both of you discussing this. Like the thing that we discuss almost every day, seeing it done by you two, it was very interesting. So thank you, Robert,
Okay.
for being here.
Thanks, Bob.
For your ideas.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Tinek. Thanks,
Thank
Sylvie.
you.
Thanks, Amelia. Have a good weekend.
Goodbye.
Have a good
Enjoyed
weekend.
it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Steve.